So we've got a ton of information to use in healthcare. Now the question is, how are we going to use it? Well, there's a lot of promise. We could use it for systems improvement. We could take a look at the quality of care given by various hospitals and physicians. But there's a potential problem there. What if we give it too early? So I don't know how many of you are familiar with or critical of ProPublica's release of physician quality measures. Is that data ready to be out there in real time and used by consumers? Can it potentially give a false impression of what the quality of care actually is? We've got precision medicine, defined under the President's Commission as disease treatment and prevention that maximizes effectiveness by taking into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle. But to do that, we need to be able to measure genotypes, environmental factors, and lifestyle risks. And with that information, then we could do things like risk prediction and treatment indication, which you'll hear more of today. We've got the ability to gauge comparative effectiveness, which drugs are better than others, which treatments are better than others, what procedures are better than others. And we can do that in terms of pragmatic randomized control trials, where we can collect and assemble a database where we can recruit patients using this data and also find out what their outcomes are. And finally, medication adherence. We know that up to 50% of patients don't take medications as prescribed, costing the US alone $100 to $300 billion a year. So what can we do in terms of big data to actually record, measure, and have in real time warnings of what patients are doing, and how can physicians use that to improve medication adherence? So one example I'd like to talk about is something that's now under FDA review, is digital pills and wearable devices. So Proteus Digital Health has teamed up with Otsuka, and both individually have approval for their separate products, but for the first time they've actually sought from the FDA approval for a digital medicine for aripiprazole, for Abilify, which will come with a 1 millimeter chip. So you take that, each pill has that chip, and when it enters, once you've digested it, it will emit a unique code which will be transmitted to a sensor that you wear, which also records your heart rate and your body position, and can send automatic alerts. So here's a condition where we're talking about a treatment indication for schizophrenia, where it is medication adherence has not only individual patient health relevance, but public health relevance as well. But where is that information going to be transmitted? To the patient's family, to the patient's physicians, to insurers, to courts? What about, is Otsuka going to eventually take out its non-digital pills? And so will patients have the ability to decide which pills they want, or will they not? And I think these are sorts of the ethical concerns that are being raised about how big data is being used really need to be addressed early, because this is going to happen one way or the other, and we need to get at the forefront of sort of implementing rules and transparency around what is happening so that physicians and consumers can make better choices. And this is really what it's about. Using it really is the hardest part. So I think that this quote from two data scientists really hits it on the nail. We get so fascinated by the concept of big data, by the technology and the potential promises, but it can be a distraction from what I think are very much important considerations. The focus on the machine is a distraction from the debate surrounding data-driven ethical dilemmas such as privacy, fairness, and discrimination. The machine may exacerbate, enable, or simply draw attention to ethical challenge, but it is humans who must be held accountable. So what sort of ethical tension are we talking about when we are going to have this discussion later today? I think it's broader than just these three factors, but I think you can view them. This is a helpful framework to sort of view the debate that we'll have. In terms of utility, there is this ability, once you actually release that data, once it's out there, people, innovators have incredible ability. You'll see what Watson's doing with that information. What can they do with that to improve public health, to improve patient care? But The degree to which that data can be free is largely limited by obstacles to use, including HIPAA and the HITECH Act, and how information can be shared. It's also limited to a certain degree by the accuracy of the information. We talked about that fourth V, veracity. And here, it's important to note that a lot of mobile health technology is not really regulated by the FDA. So in terms of clinical decision support and what you use, can you trust that information? How useful is it? And what is the risk of actually relying on it too much? How does that utility then balance with autonomy? Who owns the data? Who should own the data? What about privacy concerns? What is the risk of re-identification of supposedly de-identified data? And should patients have the ability to provide consent to use this data? And then how can this data actually be misused? You can think about uses for invasive marketing, for discrimination by employers and insurance coverage, and we've tried to tackle this by legislation, including GINA, a federal law that would prohibit employers and insurance from discriminating on the basis of genetic information. But how good are those laws? And so that, I think, is the framework really here when we're talking about big uses in data that we need to keep in mind.
We at Atrius Health think about information really as the way to begin to help us as a delivery system learn. And I'm going to go a little bit through this because this is the space that we talk about where are the threats around information gathering in big data. So hopefully this will serve as a little bit of a framework as we launch into the discussion. So for us, we think about there's a ton of data out there, not only in the traditional sense of financial claims data that we get from our healthcare colleagues, but also obviously all the EHR data that's out there. But as we go forward and we're thinking about the Internet of Things, IoT, there is lots of additional information that is becoming available. But to the point that was just raised, I'm not sure as a physician, I want sort of second by second information about how my patient's LDL seems to be changing biochemically within them. I don't know what I'm going to do with that information. And if such information is presented to me, how much does that detract from my own intellectual ability, my time, my capability that I could be spending on something that's more value added for our patients? So data is out there and data is expanding, and we recognize that, but we also recognize there's tremendous power and ability to begin to think about how do we actually measure things that matter to us. So Dr. Jha was mentioning, when we think about quality of care measures, all of us working in quality improvement today absolutely acknowledge the fact these are some ridiculous measures that we use to begin to pay and financially incentivize us. They are what Dr. Jha said. They are what we have. We've used what the data we've been collecting to be able to construct the numerators and denominators and the methodologies we use to drive quality improvement. But that doesn't have to be the case. We now have technologies that start to extract different kinds of data. And from that, there is a whole field that opens up on the same people who tried to do all the reliability studies, the sort of the effectiveness, long-term outcome studies using HEDIS information, can start to do that with different kinds of measurement as we go forward. And again, I think that's a tremendous amount of work that needs to happen along those lines. But if we don't start to push some of that, we will be continuing to be sort of under the pressure of existing less optimal measurement as we go forward. But data is step one, honestly. So there's a lot of data out there and a lot of it is completely useless. So how do you take data and transform it into information? And this is an interesting spot that comes out from the informatics side, because this is how we interpret it. And we talked about how quality measures are dependent upon value, and each one of us has a different sets of values. So the problem right now in healthcare in many senses is many of our organizations define business concepts differently from one another. And when that starts to happen, we aggregate data in different ways to sort of reflect how Atrius Health wants to see an information. What do we call an encounter? What do I call our patients? You'd be surprised how many conversations we have defining what is an encounter, what is a patient really to our organization. So those are decisions that get made. But as you know, in terms of measurement and taking a look at how do you demonstrate and measure value going forward, how you define those early elements have tremendous downstream effects. Because if you capture them wrong and you put a label on it, and it carries all the way through as the business concepts, all the analysis you start doing downstream is garbage in, garbage out. And again, at that point in time, when you see a bunch of metrics on a beautiful graph being displayed to you, you begin to say, wow, that must be truth. And we know that that's how data gets misused and inappropriately applied to drive change. And that's happening left and right in the country right now. But then beyond information, what do you do with it? Once you have a lot of dashboards and information, honestly, that data needs to get to the next level, which is knowledge and understanding. Just because you have a table of data, or in some cases, reams and reams of data in front of you, doesn't mean that you actually understand what it's telling you and whether or not you actually understand what you can do next. And that's actually another level of understanding of health informatics that has to be there in order for an organization to begin to push forward and say, how do I get value from big data, right? Because if you do not understand how to gather that understanding or that meaning from that information, really you're not going to be able to drive change in the organization going forward. This is actually a really important step because the next part is how we think about where does value come from big data and what are the ethical challenges, particularly for a delivery system or a hospital. Because we're all trying to use data to drive change in the organization for how do we improve, right? How do we improve the quality, patient experience scores, the efficiencies, all of that wrapped up together is what we're trying to do, and everyone is trying to be data-driven. So we're trying to push action, but if you have a poor understanding of the information, you're going to have a very, very poor set of strategies and tactics you're going to deploy into action. And in a world where Dr. Jha says we are running out of time and resources to sort of experiment poorly as we're going forward to try to learn how we actually take care of our patients and communities better, that luxury of being able to put 10 experiments forward, realizing that probably you should only be doing 3, but I don't really understand the data, so I'm just going to do 10. We don't have that luxury anymore going forward. So each organization, and Atrius as a whole too, is thinking about we need to be smarter and we need to be more efficient around trying to figure out what is our best bets going forward. Finally, you get to outcomes, and I think Ashish was talking a lot about measuring those outcomes because I think, again, looking at process measures within a delivery system, a hospital, a physician group practice, can only get you so far. We really care about whether or not we're making a difference in the lives of our patients. So if you don't see those, then it's really hard to sort of demonstrate that we're making change. And then finally, learning. I put this at the top because there is no blueprint for what the ideal primary care practice or ambulatory practice looks like. We know it's going to look different. We know we've got all these devices coming out. We've got sort of patient activation, everything that you can do in the app. Everyone wants to exchange information with our EHRs and say, let me take care of that before I even come see me in the office. So the world is absolutely shifting. There was a question earlier about the millennials versus the baby boomers. And if anyone has seen the data on how the millennials are interacting with the information around them, it paints a very different picture of how we as a profession are going to have to be able to interact with them as they start to require healthcare resources. And because that lack of blueprint exists, we know that there's no way we're going to get it right all the time. And this is one of the things that says, how do we drive experimentation and research? We acknowledge the fact that we have to try things because the world is moving behind us or in front of us, all around us, but we are going to get it wrong. But the sooner we can learn that we got it wrong and shift to things that we believe are actually working, again, allow us to move even quicker and faster as we move forward.